Okay, everybody ready? Yeah? Yeah, absolutely. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 5:30-ish p.m. study session. We can start with our city clerk with a confirmation of quorum.
Mayor Gilmore, confirming quorum.
Thank you very much. So tonight in our study session, we'll be talking about acoustic monitoring of Levi Stadium and the San Francisco 49ers practice facility for noise ordinance compliance. City manager?
You're not live. No.
Oh, wait, when it's red,
It's got to be green. Okay.
Okay.
So we have a little bit of a different seating configuration. I apologize with my back to the city council. We're excited that, as we mentioned last week, we were launching the community engagement program that the council directed, and we'll bring forward a work plan in January. But this is really the first part of that multi-effort program, in that we are first bringing some noise information and data and putting it out public in terms of what we've been monitoring, what the data show, as well as just providing a background on noise monitoring itself. So our objectives for today's study session is to provide an overview as noise monitoring, as I mentioned, to review specific results of the noise monitoring for the stadium, as well as receive your input. And I think what's important to notice is this is the first set of data that you will be receiving. Over the next couple of months, you will be receiving several different other sets of data as we collect them. And the goal here is not to draw conclusions, but rather to begin to assemble the data and understand how that leads to data-driven policy development. And we'll be back with you with public polling statistics, as well as robust information from our community engagement program. So as I say that, this is really one piece of multiple sets of information that we want to collect with respect to community impacts in an area that I think you will find is just basically elevated with noise, and that to surface the right gaps in either our permits, our regulations, or any other additional policy development that would be right-sized in order to fit how to solve problems out in the North Santa Clara area. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Andrew to get us started, as well as to introduce our consultant.
Thank you.
Welcome,
Andrew.
Thank you. So I'm Andrew Crabtree, Director of Community Development. And with us today is our consultant, Derek Watry, with Wilson Ehrig Acoustic Engineers. They're the city's consultant. We hired them earlier this year to help us with our monitoring of the noise situation at the stadium and around the surrounding area. So just some of the topics we're going to walk through in today's presentation. Derek's going to give us an overview of noise fundamentals, or more of the study part of the study session. A little technical. We're going to walk through what the city's regulations are, what was studied in the environmental analysis for the stadium, what the permit says about noise levels. Then we'll get to the data of what we've actually recorded, and then have a conversation about next steps and other feedback. So with that, I'll hand it over to Derek, and he's going to give us a focused but informative overview of how we analyze noise.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor, council members. I have a bit of a cold. Hope you'll bear with me. I hope I make it. It's a pleasure. I've spoken to you before. It's a pleasure to be back again. If you can't hear me, please let me know. If you can't understand me, please let me know. So we're going to start with the very beginning. Noise is the mechanical propagation of pressure waves through the air. You probably kind of have a sense of that. And there's sort of two defining characteristics. Oops. And one is the amplitude, which goes up and down. How big is this wave from top to bottom? That's what we measure in decibels. And the other one is how long is this sine wave from here to here? That's the frequency, that's in hertz. And so a high decibel, a loud sound would have a high decibel number, and a soft sound, a quiet sound, would have a low decibel number. And a long wavelength sound, like a bass guitar, would have a long wavelength. And if you had a piccolo, it would be a much shorter wavelength that would be going up and down much more rapidly. So people often confuse those two things, and it gets even more confusing a few slides down the road, but we'll we'll get there, but just so you fundamentally understand, decibels is how loud it is, and frequency is the pitch. And everybody's familiar with the piano, and the left side is the bass frequencies, and the right side is the higher frequencies. Noise is usually just defined simply as unwanted sound. So focusing for a moment on decibels, which, as I said, correlates with loudness. These are the general rules of thumb, and these are just good for people to bear in mind. A 1 decibel change is generally regarded as being not perceptible. A 3 dB change is generally regarded as being barely perceptible. A 5 dB change is noticeable, and a 10 dB change is very noticeable. And a 10 dB change is also commonly regarded as being a doubling of loudness or a halving of loudness, depending which way the change goes. And then finally, again, something that noise is measured on a logarithmic scale, like the Richter scale, which is about the only logarithmic scale people are familiar with. And just from a math perspective, it simply means that 60 plus 60 equals 63. That's all there is to it. That's the math. People say, well, why is that done in this way? It's because your hearing actually is logarithmic. It turns out a lot of the human sentences have a logarithmic characteristic to them, so it actually makes a lot of sense to do it in a logarithmic scale, but that does confuse people. But do a lot of people see noise situation? They see, well, the ambient noise level is 60, and we're adding a noise level that's also 60. Well, why isn't that 120? It's not. It's 63. So just bear that in mind. I'm not going to try to teach you all logarithmic math, but just know that it doesn't add up algebraically. So turning now to the other angle, which is the frequency in hertz, we as humans do not hear all frequencies equally. And this red curve basically mimics how human hearing functions. And this line here, I know it's hard to read, but this is 1,000 hertz, and this is 10,000 hertz. And that's where our hearing is generally peak. And then as you go lower, you don't hear it so well. And as you go higher, you also don't hear it as well. And the dog whistle is up here, which is why we don't hear the dog whistle. And there's stuff going on down here and below 20 hertz that we can't hear. But the reason this is important tonight is somebody a long time ago said, look, we've got these decibel numbers that tell you how loud something is, but then we have this hearing response, which we don't hear all things frequently. How can we combine that into a single number? And the answer is you build an electron, it used to be electronic circuitry. Now, of course, it's all done with digital signal processing. But you build a filter that basically looks just like this, and you take the incoming noise, and if all the noise was to come in at this level, then that frequency right there would be passed through exactly as it came in. This one here would actually be boosted by about a dB, and this one down here would be attenuated by about 20 dB. And you run the sound through that filter, and then you add up all the remaining decibels using logarithmic math, and you get a single number. And this curve is called the A-weighting curve. So the resulting noise measure is this thing called a dBA, A-weighted decibels. That's all you need to know for all we're talking about tonight, is that the A-weighted decibels, it's ubiquitous in noise ordinances because it's a single number that does account for both the decibel levels, how loud it is, and the frequency response of human hearing. That's why it's used ubiquitously. And over here on the right, we have a loudness comparison chart. And as you can see, a rock band is 110, and jets at 1,000 feet are 110. All the way down to 0 is the threshold of hearing. Typical neighborhood noises in the daytime are kind of between 40 and 60. Kind of sets the context. So, what you go to measure noise, what are you gonna measure? There's a whole bunch of things you can measure. The first thing you can do is you can take a sound level meter, which generally gives a readout every 1 second, and you can just look at the noise level. What is it every 1 second? It's higher this second when I'm talking than this following second where I'm not talking. Okay, the number just dropped. So you can look at that. So one thing you can look at is just these it's typically done every second, and you just get a reading every second, and that would be in this chart. Kind of that's the up and down, up and down, up and down stuff. Then, or you can take an average, and again, it's logarithmic math. Don't try this at home, but it's logarithmic average, and that black line back there, that's the average over all these peaks and valleys. And averaging is typically done over 1 hour. That's very standard. The average in acoustics is also known as the LEQ. You might see that quite a bit. That stands for the equivalent level. And those are tonight I'll try to use the word average, but if you hear me use the phrase LEQ, that's what that means. Now, again, the averaging is typically done over an hour. Now, the next step up is either the CNEL or the LDN. They're very related. I'm not going to try and I won't go into the differences. I'll just talk about the LDN because it's a little easier to understand. It's a 24-hour average. So you take instead of taking the noise over 1 hour, you take all 24 hours in a day, and every level you measure between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., you add 10 dB artificially. So if you measure 45, you actually calculate as if it were 55. And the reason you do that, of course, is because people are more sensitive to noise at night. So this is a very broad brush metric that characterizes, very broadly the daily noise exposure in different areas. Either the CNEL and the LDN, again, they're very interchangeable. They're ubiquitous in general planning documents, including the noise element in the City of Santa Clara general plan. Now, really, the other thing I want to say about the CNEL and the LDN are that they're great for things like highway noise, and they're actually pretty good. And to a lesser extent, but they're also somewhat good for airports and things like that. They're not good for things that only happen in a very limited amount of time. Like, for instance, a stadium event, it's only 3 hours out of the day. So what's the point of looking at the average noise level of that over 24 hours? Even if you wait, that's not what people are going to be reacting to. They're going to be reacting to the noise levels during the event, when in the 15 hours leading up to the event and the whatever hours after the event. They don't want to hear that you're averaging the noise over the entire day. That really is kind of meaningless to most people. So, really, the focus for something like a stadium event should be typically something like the average over the event, with maybe a nod to the maximum levels. And now back to Andrew.
Yeah. So I'll walk through some of the regulations that are part of the context of this. First, you're familiar with the city's noise ordinance. It's part of the municipal code in Chapter 9. And what's put forward there are regulations that really are focused on what are fixed sources. So you think about those are things that don't move. Someone driving in a car is not really regulated by this ordinance, but so your classic example would be like an air conditioning unit or something like that that's installed on the property. And so this is looking at like what are the impacts of the noise from that at the property line. And the ordinance establishes it uses sort of a peak. It doesn't, but it has the dBA, so it is sort of looking at frequency at the same time, and establishes a peak limit during the daytime and evening. You have two different limits, and then it also gives a penalty for sound that involves music or speech. So if someone had a speaker playing in front of their business, playing music or something like that, that would be subject to the penalty. But it says it does not. The ordinance specifically says it doesn't apply to mobile sources, including portable music amplifiers. So someone driving down the street in their car with loud music playing is not regulated through the city's ordinance. The ordinance also includes some exceptions, and two of them that I've pulled out here to emphasize. The first one is outdoor events which are conducted pursuant to a valid permit. And you'll see as we go forward that that's actually referenced in the stadium zoning, that it's considered to be looked at under this exception. And there's also an exception for firework displays. And I noted that too, because I think that's just a recognition of the ordinance. Fireworks are inherently going to violate the ordinance. There's just no way. There are things like that. There's some other things in there too, but that aren't as relevant to our discussion tonight. And so because of that first exception, as we look at the Levi Stadium activities, they're really being regulated through the zoning that the city approved for the stadium. So prior to adopting the zoning for the stadium, the city conducted an analysis of the environmental impacts that would occur with development of the stadium and prepared an EIR. And just also, for sake of clarification, what are the purposes of EIR? They were really to provide the city council and everyone in the community staff with information about what the potential impacts would be from the stadium development, and to look at ways to potentially reduce those impacts, to mitigate them. But the EIR in of itself did not establish any policy, it did not set rules that we follow. It just gave us information that we used as the city went forward with the zoning for the stadium. In the EIR analysis, they first do an analysis of existing conditions, and they noted that in the site, on the stadium site and around the stadium site, there was a lot of existing noise. It's a lot of that's related to the airport. We're close enough. We're in the flight path that every time a plane flies over, it causes somewhere in the neighborhood 60, 70 decibel sound event that exceeds our basic limits for stationary sources, but again, mobile source. And also roadway noise or other things that are contributing to those noise levels. So it's a noisy environment. They went ahead and they took noise recordings from NFL games and other events and looked at those sort of what would be expected at the source and did their analysis. And they concluded that within the neighboring neighborhoods, there would definitely be an impact that the overall sort of ambient noise levels, the typical noise levels would be higher during stadium events. So the EIR identified those as significant unavoidable impacts. They would exceed our thresholds. And the city council was asked and did approve a statement of overriding considerations, which is part of the CEQA process, where basically the city is acknowledging that they're aware that there are these significant impacts, but making a determination that there are overall objectives that the city has for the project that would be met through the project, and that it's warranted to go ahead and make that approval and override those impacts. So that was part of the EIR process. After the EIR was adopted, there was another noise study that was done by a consultant, WJHW, and this was looking at sort of, are there ways to improve the situation? Recognizing that we've identified these noise impacts, what could be done to reduce noise levels, and so it gave us guidance on how to sort of locate speakers within the stadium to try to optimize the location of those speakers to minimize the sound that would come out. The study did note that using the sort of 24-hour average was not appropriate and recommended instead using this 60 decibel 1 hour average as the design criteria. So, and that's important. That's sort of been become the basis of our permitting regulation, is that 1 hour average. So sort of saying at any point over an hour of time, we're trying to keep noise levels in the surrounding area at 60 decibels or lower. And then that got directly put into the zoning as the condition. And this is the full text of the condition from the zoning that was approved, and is also the sort of the permit condition that regulates the stadium operations. And so, without reading the whole thing, you'll note that it does include a reference to the city's noise ordinance, to the provision that's in that for exceptions through separate permits, sort of acknowledging that that's the approach that's being taken here. It references the study, the WJHW study, saying that's sort of the governing, we're following that guidance. It sets limits for speakers at the source. And then it says in the last sentence that when we set up these sound systems for events, that the target is that the maximum sound level exposure in the residential areas would be 60 decibels dBA with that sort of weighted by frequency standard. So that's what the city has in place. That's really the governing regulation for noise levels coming out of the stadium, and we start using that as the benchmark as we've gone forward with the measuring and the analysis. With that, I'll ask Derek to walk through some of the information about the monitoring program.
Thank you. So earlier this year, the city, or not just, it was actually last year, the city put out an RFP for requesting a monitoring system. We responded, were selected. But before the monitors could be put up, the U2 concert came around. And so we did that one kind of the old school way, which is somebody, and happened to be me, goes out and stands on a street corner with a sound level meter and a tape recorder and records everything, and then goes back and analyzes the data. So that's what we're here. That's what we're calling the manually monitored method. Then the noise monitors did get up in July, and there's 4 of them. I'll show you a map in a moment, and we've been using that data ever since. And I would like to take a moment here, and we might want to come back to this later during the discussion, but I just want to point out a couple of fundamental differences between doing it these 2 ways. If you're out there in person, not only do you have a recording and a bunch of data you can work with, you actually see what's going on with your own eyes and ears, and there's actually no better instruments than your own eyes and ears to determine what's happening. So it's a very high quality of data. Plus, you record absolutely everything: cars and bikes and crickets and concerts and footballs and everything. So you get the whole kit and caboodle on a recording, so you can analyze later very precisely, what you're looking at. It's labor intensive to collect because somebody has to stand around, and I was just one person. But if we wanted to do multiple locations, we would need multiple people. And I basically moved around. I started at the closest location and sort of successively moved further away. So it is a little expensive to collect, and then you also have to process all that data. Conversely, with noise monitoring, it's like a lot of stuff that's digital and electronic. It's actually cheap to collect a lot of data. The monitors aren't that expensive, and they're collecting data all the time. Even as we sit here right now, they're collecting data. Yeah, so that's good. It also does allow you to post the data on the city website, which I'm not sure actually if that's gotten done yet. No, okay, it's not done yet, but it could be. It's basically primed to do that. So if you're interested in transparency and letting the citizens kind of see what's going on, that's a good use of that, of having an automated noise monitoring station. The downsides are you don't get to record everything this way. It's just too much data for the system to handle. So you have to limit it, and you basically, at this point, we're only getting the jets. We've only, out of the thousands of recordings that have been triggered, and then what you do is you set a trigger, and then when the sound is above that trigger, you get a recording. But you need to limit the number of recordings you get. Because of all the jets, the level that we're setting it at, you basically only get the jets. So that's not terribly helpful if you're trying to figure out what's going on during a concert. And it also has turned out that so far there has been actually a lot of post-processing. Maybe that doesn't always have to be that way. We are working towards dialing it in to something that would be a little more automated. This technology didn't even exist 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. So it's a new, like a lot of people, we're sort of feeling our way through this process. I do think there's a role for these things, but I also, as we'll get back to later, I also think we should go back to a blend of both manual and the monitors, and we'll get to that in our conclusions. Here are the monitor locations. So it's probably pretty obvious to you, but there's a stadium. The closest one is here, Cheney and Lenox. That one's really key. That's the one we've basically focused on because it is just south of the stadium. This is the open end of the stadium, and so there's more sound leaks out this direction, if you will. There's one a little further down on Cheney. There's one over in front of Hughes Elementary, and there's one at the intersection of Arboles and De Lagos. And these are generally shielded by these are more shielded by the grandstands, which are high on this side. So this is our first slide with results. This is the U2 concert, and again, this was done old school way, so there's a lot of information that you get this way that we won't have for the other ones. But what we did here was I did take some ambient recordings before the concert began when I was at Genie and Lennox, so you can see information on the background levels. You can see information on what the jet aircraft are doing. You can see what a car does. And then the concert began, and I was only there for 15 minutes, but during the first 15 minutes of the concert, and the concert was pretty consistent, I believe, during the whole show. During the first 15 minutes, the lowest level was 50, which is about what it was normally anyway. The highest went to 70. That was definitely the show. And this thing I call the core range, which is you exclude the bottom 10% of the time and the top 10% of the time. It's just kind of a better, you get rid of the really kind of anomalously high and low readings, and you get this core reading of 56 to 64, which I think is very representative of how it affects the show in general. So as you can see, that means it's basically like having a car pass by all the time. It's not as loud as a jet, but it is quite a bit louder than the background. And then the average over that time period was 61. That's the only reading we've gotten so far on that evening. And then I moved to the other locations. I went to over here to 4624 Cheney and then Hughes and Arbalest and Lago. And as you can see, as you get further away, this is simply further away. This is further away, and it's actually not further away, but it's shielded a bit by the bandstands. And then this is both far away and shielded. So as you get further and further away, the average gets lower and lower. So this is now all of the events. Now we're only looking at data from Cheney and Lennox, that closest monitor, because if it doesn't go over here, it's not going to go over anywhere. So this is the closest one, and for these ones, the U2 data is repeated up here. That's just the same data we just looked at for the Cheney and Lennox position. All the other ones are coming from the noise monitoring station, and all we can really do for these ones is take out the jets. It's obvious from the noise levels over time what a jet is. They all kind of look the same. As you can imagine, as the jet approaches, the sound kind of ramps up, it peaks, and it ramps back down again. So it's pretty obvious what a jet looks like. So we take out all the jets, and then we run the numbers. It doesn't take out cars. There's no viable way of really knowing what's a car, what's not a car. So again, all we do is take out the jets. Now that means, of course, that this is somewhat conservative because this does include other things going on, not just the event. So it's actually a conservative way to look at these things. And jumping. The key point is that no other event other than the U2 concert has exceeded that 60 dBA hourly average. And by the way, I should point out again that this was only over the first 15 minutes of the concert, and then I moved locations. This is actually over the entire event. So this is generally 2 hours for a concert and 3 hours for a football game, and 2 hours for the CONCACAF games or soccer games. So we have 2 soccer games, a bunch of 49er games, and then we have one additional concert, which is a Coldplay concert, and that average was 58. Again, I'm showing the core range here, which I think is something you might want to keep an eye on. The U2 concert was definitely loudest. They must have won this one because they're a little louder here. The CONCACAF game, actually, they didn't? No, oh well. CONCACAF game was also over 60, and this is just the core range. This means that 10% of the time it was louder. It was 62 or louder, and 64 or louder. But here, from here on down, Coldplay concert on down, you see that most of the time, 90% of the time, it's less than 60 dBA, and again, the average was 58. So this is. Bear with me. I'm going to try and walk you through this. This is the kind of data that the noise monitoring system gets us. And this shows a distribution of the sound levels over the entire event. the key point I want to point out here, so this is, the green is a bunch of days where there were no events, so we're calling that the ambient range. You can see that during events, the levels do rise up in general over the ambient range, just as the EIR said they would. 60 is right about here, though. See, 60 is across here. So a lot of this is kind of it's kind of in the zone where it doesn't matter too much. The zone that kind of matters is right in here, especially particularly right in here, where it's above 60 and above the ambient range. So that if people notice anything, this is kind of what they're probably notice. I mean, they may notice all of this, but this is the only area where it's really above the ambient range and above that 60. But again, these are second by second levels. These aren't hourly averages. Here's the oh, and by the way, we have it sorted into two different kinds of days. These are daytime events, which are basically 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. And these are evening and nighttime events, which are 5 p.m. to 11 p.m. This thing right here, this blue line, that's the U2 concert. So as you can see, even though it was much above the ambient in the 60 range, it was actually quite a bit above the ambient the whole way through. It was just consistently above the ambient level. So that's why it got the highest average. That's also why, if anybody, if people were going to notice it, they would have noticed it. Again, I was out there that evening. I can tell you that at both the locations on Cheney, the lyrics were plainly audible. And when I got over to Hughes, it was audible. It was still easy to pick out the songs. It wasn't as clear. And then by the time I got over to Arbalace, it was more of a distant thing. You could hear it if you listened to it, but it didn't sort of dominate. But certainly at Cheney and Lenox, which is where this data is from, during the concert, there's no doubt about it, the concert noise dominated the soundscape. So this, if we were going to carry, well, to the extent we carry forward the noise monitoring station, and this is one I would carry forward with, this is the one at Cheney and Lenox, the next step in this process would be to try to figure out some way to kind of automate this analysis so that it would know to when it sees a situation like this to flag it somehow, I guess. But that's where I have the noise monitoring system data. Okay. All right. So this is to summarize the noise level measurements to date. This is data you've already seen. Again, we've got just two things: Coldplay, U2, and the 49er games. We left the CONCACAF games off. As far as the 1 hour average goes, U2 is above 60, Coldplay was below 60, and the 49er games have all been below 60. And that's really, I guess, the basis of the permit condition is basically tied to that average. So that's where you're at there. Maximum levels do go over that. Currently, with the Jets at around 75 is kind of typical. U2 is below that. Coldplay actually hit that. That was the fireworks. They had a fireworks display at the end, so they actually managed to meet the Jets. And the 49er games, I know there's a jet flyover in one of them, and I don't know if they have fireworks or not. No. They've also got maximums that have approached the level of the Jets. And then again, this core range is I don't know how much that is to you. We can talk about the core range if you're interested in later. We put it up there for discussion purposes. And now I'm going to go back to Deanna.
Just in terms of wrapping up, we wanted to just go over, as I mentioned earlier, it is premature to make some policy decisions, but we did want to just put some comments or some findings from our perspective of what's important to consider as you provide input and as we begin to think this topic through. The in-person monitoring provides better data. I think we learned that through the U2 concert and the data that we were able to receive. But we do want to look at our noise monitoring program to make sure that whatever we put in place is sustainable. There is significant ambient noise out there. If you look at I think it was slide 16, where it shows that even with cars, when we look at the core range, it is above the DBA. It was going from 63 to 64, maximum at 64. And so there's, as I mentioned earlier, it's a loud area, and even at the car level, it is proving so. The noise levels are less than what was forecasted in the EIR, the development permit condition based on 1 hour average noise levels. And we'll need to talk through in future months as to what we deal with when we look at noise, whether it's based on averages over what increment of time versus maximum and minimums and core ranges. If you look at the development permit, it's not clear in terms of which standard we should interpret that through. And so we'll want to bring back some of our best thinking so that we can provide you with some measures that we can address any concerns that surface as we continue to do additional work. The U2 concert exceeded the permit condition maximum by 1 dBA. Coldplay concert was within target noise levels. And if I pull your attention to, I think it was slide 17, and we look at the core range, we did show that U2 on average, if we look at average dBAs, it was exceeding the noise level standard. And if you look at the core range, though, you can say that half of the events, or about half of them, were at or above the 60 dBA level. And so that's just some context in terms of a lot of moving pieces that we'll need to consider as we continue this work that we're launching today.
Okay, thank you. I think we have some questions, starting with Councilmember O'Neill.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So this is all very interesting, and Councilmember Watanabe and I had a meeting with someone last week who was explaining also to us about noise, more particular about some of the challenges with the new flight patterns into San Jose Mineta International Airport. But so one of my questions is, I also last week we had a meeting of the Architecture Committee, which is the venue through which, like, Great America Theme Park has a relatively new master plan that was adopted. And they were presenting a very exciting looking new roller coaster. It's their second one under this new plan. And so, there were some issues that came up about the noise. And so I was talking about these monitoring stations. So my question has to do with those locations along Cheney. And if it was like the automated approach where they're on and we're collecting data, do you think that would be a good way to do some monitoring of when the theme park is open late at night, in terms of when, particularly as these new, very thrilling rides get built, even though they did detail a lot of their plans for deadening the sound or deflecting it and absorbing it, but would these monitoring stations work to help us assess what possible impact, particularly the residents, as more so than I'm thinking the businesses that are in the office buildings, are what they're hearing from those new rides?
I would say not initially. I think at this point, the monitoring stations have proven themselves very useful for basically construction noise monitoring, where you're introducing a new, totally different noise into an area, and there's a clear sort of like ceiling limit. They're not allowed to go over a certain limit. They're really good at helping you figure out if you're over that limit or not. Something like this, and like the Great America, it's a little more subtle to deter, especially if you're looking, particularly if you're trying to figure out if it's from one particular ride or if it's a totality. So I would, at this point, I would recommend that you hire somebody to go out and, again, eyes and ears, and try to figure out what's going on, at least initially. And that may be all you need to do, because you may just find that that's also a situation where it's, once it's up and running and once the park is doing its thing, until they add another ride, it's going to be pretty consistent, right? It's not going to change a lot. So there's no real need for ongoing monitoring. I would just say you go out there, you have somebody look at it in detail, using their eyes and their ears, and then you sort of figure it out. That's what I would recommend in that situation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Davis?
Thank you, Mayor. I too found this kind of interesting, because at that level that we gave them, that 60, is it decibel? What is it, dB?
You got say
Okay.
dBA, 60 dBA.
Okay, so at that level, it says a large business office, which comprises of a lot of people. So when you did your 1 hour survey, I was wondering, in that 1 hour, was it normal game day play? Was there touchdowns happening? I mean, like, I think that depends on what hour of the day that you did this survey.
Well, again, so are you looking at the data here on the screen?
Right.
Yeah. So for the 49er games, here we're actually doing an average over the whole game. So obviously that I made a quip earlier that you know they must have won this game because the noise levels were louder. Andrew corrected me and said no, in fact they didn't. So I can't tell you why that one was louder.
Well, that was a game that was very high scoring.
Oh, that's right. You looked it up the other
something
day.
like 45, 41
Rams
or
game.
something
That's
like
right.
that.
They
but-
lost by 2. That's right. Yeah, they lost by 2 and they were.
That was May 17th?
Uh,
No, I'm sorry.
yeah.
That was
September.
September 21st.
First, right. So they ended up losing by 2. They were making a late game comeback. So yeah, that's why there was more noise. Again, we know that because Andrew looked it up on the internet and read about the game. Without anybody being out there, if you just get a bunch of numbers, which is what the noise monitoring system gets, you don't get that kind of observation.
Then my second question was, there's also the setup and breakdown of concerts. Was that factored into the noise levels?
No, the noise levels shown here are strictly from the time the band comes on stage to the time the band leaves the stage.
Okay. And then my next thing was practice sessions. I know you had a couple of them up there. You have 49er game, PS. Is that practice
No, the good
preseason?
preseason.
Okay, so
Good.
let's get back to practice sessions. We were given a lot of complaints about those during the day and the noise level on that. Did you monitor one of those?
Well, again, the noise monitoring system
Okay.
gets everything, but that hasn't been brought to our attention yet. The data's there. We could go back if somebody tells us when a practice session was that somebody complained about. We could go back and look at it post facto.
Okay, because, yeah, that we definitely have to look at that one. And then, okay, in this big thing here, how many people were in the stadium on each one of these? Because you don't have that listed here. Doesn't it go by the amount of how many bodies you have and, you
Yeah,
know,
actually-
is that factored into your methodology at all? Sorry, sorry.
I'll just, while he's drinking, I'll mention that a lot of this is actually the amplified sound that's what's really traveling. So, how many people are at the U2 concert? It's really the people that are singing in the microphones or the instruments that are generating a lot of what's carrying. But, we can go back and look at that. I mean, the preseason games were quieter than the regular season games, and we know that.
Because there's not a lot of people at the preseason games. Okay.
Right. So I got my voice back, so I can jump in. You're absolutely correct. I mean, if you have a full stadium and they're all cheering at one time, that's going to be more. Now, it is logarithmic, so it gets back to the decibels. If the stadium is half full and everybody yells their loudest, and then the stadium is completely full and everybody yells their loudest, it's only going to be a 3 dB difference. It gets back to that 60 plus 60 equals 63 thing. It's a logarithmic scale, so if you double it, you only get plus 3 dB. So I'm just saying it's not that. I don't know how the 49ers are doing that. I'm not following them this year. So I don't know how they're doing in terms of
Capacity.
capacity.
filling the-
Yeah, how are they? I mean,
They give us different numbers, so we don't
okay.
really know.
But if they're selling out 3/4 of the stadium, it's not going to be that, and they do all yell for some reason. It's going to be 1 or 2 dB difference than if they have a 100% capacity stadium.
Okay, and I think the thing that triggered this was the Beyonce concert, and I'm pretty sure it was way over to 61. Because
Well, that happened before we were
that was
retained.
before you never measured that.
No, that
Okay,
happened before this whole thing. I think that's what kicked off this whole process.
yes, it did.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess those are my questions for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Councilmember Watanabe?
Thank you, Mayor. I'm the person that lives out there. And so I'm quite familiar with a lot of the complaints that, triggered this request. And I really appreciate the work that you've done. And Mr. Crabtree, I really appreciate you following up on this. And because I've received a lot of complaints and hear from a lot of folks out there. You're absolutely right about Lenox and Cheney, the closest, neighborhood to the stadium. And Arborlace, I've talked to people that live out there, and they have said themselves, they're not impacted. They don't hear a lot of things like they do over in Lenox and Cheney, so that makes absolute sense. And it's just coincidental that Councilmember O'Neill and I did have this very intense meeting with this gentleman who's done a very in-depth study on airplane noise, and hearing you talk about how the jet aircrafts are triggering the noise. I mean, it just factors into really the noise impact that's out in that community, and it just adds to it. And think it's fascinating that you're able to withdraw or take out the airplane noise so that you can get a more accurate decibel level, what the noise is out there. Because I can only imagine what it must be if both were factored in together. My husband and I, we have seasons tickets, so we've been to several of the games, and I can tell you right now that attendance has not been that great. So, and we're right near the field, so I definitely have a good bird's eye view. So I think that the lower decibel levels that you're receiving from some of the games that's definitely a factor. And so again, I can only imagine if the team was having a better season, it would be a lot louder out there. But I like the fact that you're able to gather these numbers and give us an idea of what's how the neighborhood is being impacted. One Sunday morning, Councilmember Davis, she brought up about the practice fields. I received a complaint on a Sunday morning. It was Mother's Day, and at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I went out there. It was last year, it was 2016, and I physically went out there myself. So, and I totally agree, being hands-on definitely makes a much better difference than just, turning on a system and collecting the data. Hands-on definitely makes a difference, because as soon as I went out there, I was in my car with the windows rolled up, and I could feel the bass coming from the practice field across the street in my car with the windows closed. So that was pretty loud. But, going forward, I mean, I agree that I think it's premature to make policy decisions now based on the data that you've presented tonight. I think there's still a lot of factoring that needs to be looked at, and also hearing from the community as well. But just having this right now, I really appreciate, and I think it's a really good starting point. So thank you.
You're welcome. If I may ask you a question, because you do go to the games, because there's a bit of a caveat to what I told Councilmember Davis about the crowd doubling. If it's on a capacity crowd, do they all tend to sit down low, or are they sort of distributed even up in the higher seats?
72,000 people.
Yeah, there are very many people in
it's
the higher
everywhere.
seats, yeah.
But my question is, so if only half if let's say it's only at 50% capacity, are they in the lower 50%, or are they sort of sprinkled all around?
No, capacity is 3 levels.
Right, but he's
No,
saying, are they
Debbie.
concentrated
Ye-
or are they
yeah.
scattered? And I think from what I
Oh,
see on
no.
television, they look like they're scattered.
Yeah, they're definitely scattered.
Get around.
Yeah.
It's not like they all just sort of move down to the lower.
I would say, yeah, probably more, I think there are more people in the end zones than there are throughout the stadium.
Okay, because
Just-
that would also make a difference. If they all sort of moved down to the lowest seats, then what I said about doubling would not actually hold, because those other people, as more people came in, they'd get closer and closer to the top, and of course that means that they'd be less, shielded by the stadium itself. So I was just curious, since you said you were there.
Mhm.
Yeah, okay, I understand it's not open seating, so so they are probably distributed. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I do have a question. First of all, thank you very much for this information. It's very helpful for us to see at least some data points as to where, some of these events are really showing us what the noise levels are in the area. So it's going to be very helpful in all of our deliberations as we go forward. I spent many years as a representative on our Airport Noise Advisory Committee when we were doing all the airport noise renovations on the homes in that entire area. So I spent a lot of time talking about noise, but I thought the airport used to have a hotline that you could call in and get real-time information on noise levels from the jets. And when there would be a particularly noisy jet, it used to be Alaska Airlines coming in, and the noise levels would spike, but there was some real-time information that our citizens used to be able to get. Will we get to the point here where we will be able to show that information real time for our residents to be able to see what the noise levels are at any particular moment in the city, to see some real actual noise levels?
Yeah. So for the monitors that we have in place, we have the ability to put the data that they're recording on, in terms of like decibel levels, second by second, or in 3 minute or 5 minute, or some sort of format, out so that the public can see it. And it can we can make recordings when noise levels are above a certain level. So it is possible for someone from the public to say, okay, what caused that spike? Let me listen to it, and you'll hear usually 9 times out of 10 it'll be an airplane flying over or something like that. But so it's really, we don't have the ability to obviously do some of the sort of analysis and trying to screen out what's the cause and so forth that's been in this presentation. So I think there's still a little bit of work for us to try to figure out what's the best way to put it out there that's going to be useful to people, but that we have that ability to set up something, a public-facing website where there would be access to that data.
Right, I think that's when we talked about previously, when this gentleman was hired for that type of noise evaluation, that we would eventually come to the point where we could put all the information online for the public to be able to see what's happening real time, or hear what's happening real time in that area. So I'm hoping we get to that point. I know there's technology available to be able to do that, so.
Yeah, and I think the best we can do is about a 3-minute delay.
It takes about 3 minutes for the data to get posted. But what I want to say, we have worked on that quite a bit. We have an almost ready to go website that we could post that on. The main issue that we're running into is if you just put the raw data out there, it's just a lot of it's just a big graph with a lot of lines on it. It's not clear to me that anybody would know what to do with that. I think that's where we kind of got. That's where Andrew and I kind of got stuck, was how do you put it out there in a way that's meaningful for people? They can look at it and say, "Oh, that's good, that's bad." What does that mean? Otherwise, it's just a bunch of what I call hash. It's just a bunch of lines that go up and down because here's a jet, and here's a car, and here's a jet, and here's a car, and it's kind of hard for people to understand what they're looking at.
Are you familiar with what San Jose International Airport puts out in terms of their noise?
I could look at their noise monitoring. So I haven't looked at it in detail, but I could
take a look at
wink
that?
at it and see what they got.
If I can add just one item regarding the website. So I did review kind of the data and the website that we have right now. And really one of the key things we wanted to do was going to be able to have this study session with the council as we're trying to figure out the best format to be able to present it to you. It's kind of helping us develop the best format to be able to present it to the community. The amount of data that we have could be overwhelming if it's just put out there. So we are, I think sometime early next year, we will have a website, and we might not hit it, 100% the first time you see it, but I'm sure we'll get feedback to help us kind of present the data even better. But we have the data. We have some draft website work that's going to allow it to be public facing. And with this feedback, early next year, our goal would be to put it out there for public use.
Oh, thank you. That's really important, I think, for us to get to that point. Thank you for that information. Councilmember Watanabe, your light's still on? You have more questions?
Turned it
Yes,
back on.
please.
No, just one more statement. With talking about the airplane and the airflow, I mean, the area has definitely been impacted. One thing, well, actually, Mr. Crabtree and probably the city manager and Councilmember O'Neill and I learned a lot about the south flow air traffic and next gen. FAA has come up with this new policy of next gen, and so airplanes are now, like when they're in the south flow pattern, they are actually coming straight down Lafayette Street heading into SJC, and so that's having a big impact in the area as well. When it's a south flow day, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a south flow day for the air traffic to be coming down Lafayette. So it has definitely had a significant impact on the community, as I've learned, and that's actually one of the things that we're looking at, and they've started a new ad hoc committee. Not to go into a whole lot of detail, but there's an ad hoc committee right now looking at ways to try and redirect that air traffic if possible. So, just to add that.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Any other questions? All right, members of the public, please come forward.
I appreciate getting the information. The one thing I would ask for you to reconsider, I'd like to see the data up now, and then as you figure out how to formulate it differently, we'll do it differently, but I think we have a lot of people within our city that are very accustomed to dealing with statistics and data, and they could create their own reports given the data, and they could refine it themselves. And I think you should give the public the opportunity to have the data and use it the way they want to use it, and then you decide how you want to use it. But I would really encourage you, the commitment was to put it up as soon as possible, and to wait until next year is not meeting the commitment that was made to the public, and this has already been since July. So I would really encourage you to put it up now as it is and let people use it as they want, because a lot of people can write their own software, and like I said, we got 12-year-olds that can do a better website than we've been doing, so I'm sure they can figure out how to harvest that data and use it. Secondly, in taking out the noise created by the airplanes, is that really doing it correctly? My question is, I know that when you have an event at the stadium, you can't control the airplanes, but that is adding to the noise, and that's real. So why are we taking that information out? That is an impact on the neighborhood, and taking those, that I would contend that that is part of the situation, and that should be in there as part of the noise and the numbers that are being considered. I don't think you should be screening that out. If you're there, that's part of the whole noise that you're experiencing. And that was part of the discussion when this whole thing came about. I think taking it out is doing the wrong thing for the public. It needs to be looked at collectively, and that's how noise is dealt with as a whole, not in harvesting pieces and taking pieces out. So I think that really should be looked at that way, or at least consider that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, so maybe I can ask our noise consultant about the cumulative noise and the thought about taking out the airplane noise when it's should be all together as what, adding all these things together. What is a resident facing out there in terms
Sure.
of
No,
noise?
that's a good-
So how are we looking at that and breaking that down?
Yeah, well, I understand the point. It's a good point. Noise is cumulative, the EIR, which I didn't do the EIR myself, so I'm not totally familiar with how they did it, but they should have done a cumulative analysis that should have looked at that. I presume they did. I mean, the easiest thing for us to do now would be to go back and actually reanalyze this with and without the jets and just see what the difference is. That would be one way. That would be the easiest way to do that. I think there is value. I will say I do think there is value in looking at what is the event itself doing. But you're right. But there's value in that, because you do want to know what is the concert adding. How do you going to do that by taking out the jets? But we could look at it both ways. That would be relatively simple to do.
I think it would be important, but I like the fact that you actually separated them so we can see what, as you're adding all these pieces on top of each other, what's actually, putting it over the limit. But I think as far as our residents and what they're experiencing out there, they may not, decipher between the noise and break it down as to what it is. They just know that it's bothering them at
Sure.
whatever point if it's
Right.
exceeding. And so they don't probably much care what caused it. The fact is it's impacting their life. So I think we need to look at it, the
We can do that.
cumulative, but I'd like to see which pieces are, the effects of whatever pieces are, whether it's a game, a concert,
Right.
a soccer
But-
game,
but
whatever it is. Yeah.
We'd have the two constitutive components. I mean, the easy ones to pull out, as I said earlier, were the jets, because it's obvious that they're jets. But we could have, like, this is what's from the event, this is from the jets, and this is the total. That would be helpful.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other questions, comments? City Manager, do you have any closing statements before we're?
So as our next step, just continuing on this effort, we will be back with a work plan presentation on either January 23rd or 30th. We're going to move that up from February, as I mentioned last week.
Okay. All right, so thank you all very much, and thank you so much for the report and the staff. And we are going to end the study session now and be back at 7 p.m. in 20 minutes for the actual council meeting. Thank you.
It's funny. Well, the last time I lost my voice,